I'm Jasmine Rani, a senior lecturer at the University of St Andrews, and I'll be chairing this session. And it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to our keynote of the conference. We have over 35 people here and the numbers are growing, so no pressure, maybe. We'll have more, I think, joining as well. I just want to start off by thanking everybody for attending, being part of the conference. We had really fantastic set of panels and papers yesterday, and we were just discussing amongst our organizing team throughout the day yesterday, in fact, that we were really impressed and pleased with the quality of the papers, the research and the dedication that had gone into them, but also the level of engagement from all of the audience. The questions that people gave were really in depth and had shown that people were really engaging with the papers. So a huge thanks for that. And if you've just joined for this keynote session and you hadn't attended for the rest of the conference, then you're very welcome to stay with us. We have 2 more panels this afternoon and a full day tomorrow as well. I put a reminder in the chat that if you want to tweet about the keynote, then you can use the hashtag multipolarmina. And just also to say thank you again to our 3 excellent CEPAD PhD assistants, Aya Del Rafai, Olivia Glombitza, and Elias Razal, who have been instrumental in helping us with the logistical side of things. A huge thank you to them. So I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, my brilliant and very smart colleague, and I don't use that compliment lightly, Dr. May Darwish. And I will just say a bit about her. There's a lot to choose from, so I've had to be selective. May is a lecturer, currently a lecturer at the Department for International Relations in the University of Birmingham. She actually joined in January this year. And prior to that, from 2016, she was actually at the University of Durham. She is also a trustee of the Council for British Research in the Levant, and she is also on the steering committee for the Project on Middle East Political Science, POMEP, so doing great work. And she's also the director of the Arab Political Science Network since 2019. Despite all of that and being busy on all those fronts, she's also published a lot. So I will just mention some of her publications that she's written about Saudi policies in Yemen, in global policy. She's also written about foreign policy analysis and theoretical approaches in international relations, and she's published in also Foreign Policy Analysis Journal and Mediterranean Politics, amongst others. I think it's fair to say the most stellar of her excellent publications is her latest book, which is titled, give the full title, Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region. And that's published by Cambridge University Press. It was published last year. If you haven't had a chance to read it, then do go and buy it straight after this keynote session. And I think Curtis Ryan put it nicely yesterday that this book is one that it's not just empirically and historically rich and rigorous, but what's really interesting about the book is that it's also theoretically eclectic, right? And I think it's fair to say, and you can correct me on this, but it sits broadly within a realist framework, but it's a good example of how that can be done in a nuanced way that still provides space for other methodological and theoretical insights. So I won't say too much more about it because that's what May is going to be speaking about in her keynote. I will be, I'll stop speaking in a minute just to mention that May will speak for about half an hour to 40 minutes. There will be a chance for questions and answers. So you're welcome to put your questions in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can do that as the keynote progresses. If I can request that you kindly keep your questions brief so that we can get through as many as possible, right? So I'm really glad to stop talking now and hand over to May.
Well, thank you, Jasmine, very much for this very, very I don't know, delightful presentation and introduction. I'm really glad to be speaking to you all today. I'm just going to share my screen the first thing so I can start the presentation. I hope you can all see the slides now. If not, please indicate anything. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much for the organizers of this really successful event for inviting me for this keynote. It's a real pleasure, and I'm really happy to be presenting some of the ideas about the book, but also some of the current research that I've been working on alliances. And mainly, I'm going to try to keep my presentation as short as possible to allow more for questions and for discussions. So the first thing that really drew my attention to alliances, to the questions of threat perception in the region, it's complexity. Anyone just can type alliances in the Middle East in like Google Images, and you will end up with these very messy diagrams about how alliances are shifting, but not just that they're shifting, it's also involving multiple actors, some non-state actors, state actors, and it's all the time sometimes looking very contradictory. Some alliances where they were not expected to happen, they're happening, others are enduring, others are collapsing, and therefore these puzzles have constantly been at the core of many IR books, but also theories, and used many of the Middle East cases in order to develop understanding about alliances, about threat perception in general. And personally speaking, I was very intrigued, especially when I was an undergraduate student at Cairo University in 2006, at the Iran support of Hezbollah in 2006. But more importantly, as I was in Egypt, I was very puzzled by the Egyptian position towards Hezbollah. And that was not particularly unique in the region at the time. There was also Saudi Arabia and Jordan, that all of the sudden you realize, well, the enemy is not really Israel. The enemy is Hezbollah. You would open the TV, you would talk to people in the streets, and everyone is just saying, well, Hezbollah is the ultimate threat. And for me, that was very puzzling, considering Egypt is a strong nationalist state in the region with a very strong army. And all of a sudden, when you hear that a non-state actor is not even sitting on the borders of Egypt, being considered a national security threat. And that really pushed me to think about how states come to understand these questions of threat perception. How do they make alliances? How do they make these decisions about what is the ultimate and the most threatening actor in their environment? And therefore, I started looking more in the literature, and it became very clear that this case of Hezbollah, it's not particularly unique. But looking back in the history in 1979, what would also come, for example, to the 1980, or more particularly 1979 question, where the Iranian Revolution caused some discomfort in the Arab world, but also questions about what is the ultimate threat here. At the time after the revolution, to an extent, the Iranian new regime realized that the army is not their most loyal institution, and they started dismantling but also reducing Iranians' military capabilities. And at the time, Saddam Hussein was building up his military arsenal, showing more ambition to become the dominant regional power. But nevertheless, these two realities were not perceived the same way in the region. Some countries saw, for example, that the rise of Saddam Hussein was a real threat to the stability and security of the regimes, like in Syria. But others, for example, in the Gulf, they really considered the Iranian Revolution to be the most important threat. And here's a quote from the Kuwait Foreign Ministry, an official who was working there. He was saying, in April 1980, an attempt was made on Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, life, and there were some clashes along the Iran-Iraq border. At that time, Iran offered us to sell their Phantom airplanes to Kuwait. When we were told them we were not interested, they asked us to relay the offer to the Saudis. They were not interested either. This showed us that Iran was not really thinking of entering a war. And that was really the situation in early 1980s. The fact that Iran was already selling its military equipment, but more importantly, that the Gulf countries were very much aware of that reality. Nevertheless, they still considered Iran to be a threat, and supported Saddam Hussein in a very long war against Iran. So the book really started with this kind of puzzle. How come that we have this divergent perception? On the one hand, we have Saudi Arabia, who really considered the Iranian revolution to be the ultimate threat, even though at the time knowing that Iran was really not interested in a war, it's not really building up its military capabilities, and at the same time knowing very well that Saddam Hussein had very strong ambitions in the region. On the other hand, Syria, which at the time was a very secular regime, a pan-Arab ideology was dominant, a Ba'athist ideology even, and at the time they realized, well, Iran is really not the threat. The Islamic revolution is not the threat. The Islamic message coming from the revolution is not really our ultimate worry here. It's rather the military buildup that's happening in Iraq. And therefore, these divergence between these two states led to this huge, let's say, huge or important decisions that were made in 1980 that basically changed the outlook of the region for a very long time. And until now, there are several implications for these decisions that were made. Saudi Arabia supported Saddam Hussein in the war, and on the other hand, Syria aligned with Iran against Iraq. And to an extent, the literature talking about these questions, about how threat perceptions are evolving, how they shape alliance decisions, they were not particularly clear about this puzzle. What happens if we have some decisions that were mainly predominantly driven by ideational fears, where others' decisions are predominantly shaped by material concerns, threats coming from military factors? And to an extent, looking at the literature, I was as puzzled by many Middle East scholars looking at the literature. There are two extremes, or there are two positions that stand on the sides of the literature. The one coming from the realist perspective, saying, well, threat perception is really about the material factors. It's about the military build-up, the geographical proximity. And this argument was very clear in Stephen Wald's The Origins of Alliances. And on the other hand, other scholars came, well, they said it's not really about the material or the military factor, it's rather about our ideas, our interpretation of these military factors that actually matter and that shape our threat perception. And that's coming from the constructivist side. For example, the book of Barnett, Dialogues in Arab Politics. Many scholars looking at the Middle East, they realized, well, these two extremes cannot explain everything. Ironically, the cases that are explained by Wald's book are exactly the cases that form the exception in Barnett's book, and the other way around. So many of the exceptions that Wald could not explain, for example, how similarity in identity can create threats, where the pattern that Barnett created his own understanding of alliances in the region. And therefore, these two books and these two understanding of alliances seemed in a very way complementary in that sense. Nevertheless, the literature didn't really tell us, okay, but how to understand these two together? What happens if we have some cases that fit the constructivist paradigm approach, but other cases just fit the realist paradigm? How to put this together? How to have a more comprehensive view? Some scholars decided to actually stay in the middle of this, saying, well, it's actually both. It's ideational and material. And we have a collection of books like Curtis Ryan yesterday presented, but also Larry Rubin and other books emerging all along, talking about how they are both coming to shape this idea of threat perception, but also talking about regimes as a unit. We're not really talking about states in the Middle East, it's rather regimes talking about their own survival, their own security at the heart of that decision. So when I started basically developing that sort of understanding, I came to appreciate the complexity of these theories, but the literature as well. And the missing gap was how to reconcile these, how to understand some of the cases, but also make room for the exceptions to also be understood and accounted for. And therefore, my understanding formed the argument of that book, that we have in most alliance decisions, we have ideational factors and we have material factors. And at the same time, it's not like the way the constructivist would say that they're co-constituted and they shape each other, but they're rather separate. They're two spheres that are independent and they influence each other, they shape each other. But in some cases, we have the ideational factors to be more predominant, and in other cases, the material factors are just the one predominant. And the book was really concerned about showing this dynamic, but also trying to tease out what are the conditions for these two options. What are the conditions for the material to be more predominant? And what are the conditions for the ideational to be predominant? And therefore, I found many answers to several questions that are missing in the literature on ontological security, for example. And ontological security, it's more of an understanding of how actors, how individuals in general come to exist and how they come to understand their own security, in the sense that they need some coherence in their identity, their consistency in the narrative that they tell about their identity, but also some continuity in the surrounding environment, whether it's a material environment, a regional environment. And therefore, the ontological security is actually one of those concepts that we're missing to understand, for example, why sometimes we have cases where states are threatened and we don't see that. For example, why Saudi Arabia has been threatened by the Muslim Brothers, even though they share the same identity, they share the same Sunni ideology. And more importantly, the Muslim Brothers are not really a material threat to any of the regional ambitions of Saudi Arabia. But also, on the other hand, looking at this sort of security, there is also the physical security that still matter. In some cases, the geographical proximity matters, the military factors matter, and all of that sometimes come to shape decisions of threat perception. And two conditions were crucial to understand this dynamic in my argument were the fluidity of identity, to what extent some identities are flexible, to what extent they can be shaped and reshaped according to the material structure. Are there flexible identities or they're rigid, and so on. And also the clarity of the material structure. To what extent actors, when they are behaving in a regional environment, they see their material structure to be clear? Do they see clear options coming or not? And to be more, let's say, more practical in presenting this argument, I'm not going to bore you too much with the details of the theory, but if you're interested, there are several tables in the book that talk about this, about the different options and the different possibilities. But more importantly, I want to move to one of the cases that the book talks about to show you how I am actually explaining that in one of the cases. So the book is talking about three main cases. It's comparing Saudi and Syrian threat perceptions and alliance decisions in three regional wars: Iraq War, and the Lebanon War, and the Gaza War. And in every instance, I look at the ideational and the material factor in every decision and how they've come to shape threat perception. So the first case that I looked at was the Iran-Iraq War. And very clearly, the Saudi case was a case of perceiving the message coming from the Iranian Revolution as the ultimate threat, as the most, let's say, dangerous factor in the region at the time. And this was particularly based on an ideational perspective. It was not really a material perspective at the time. Iran was not interested in a war. It was dismantling its army, but also more importantly, it had to grapple with so many domestic instability. So at the time, Iran was not particularly posing any military threat to the Saudi kingdom. Instead, the Iranian Revolution came with a very similar message to what the Saudis are trying to advocate in the region, which is a pan-Islamic perspective. that all Muslims should be one ummah, they should all ally together, they should be united, and they should not be separated. And surprisingly, instead of this ideology or perspective bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together, it rather drove them apart. And in fact, it was this ontological security of the Saudi kingdom that kicked in, because the Saudi kingdom has been trying to forge a distinct narrative about its own presence, its own role, its own identity in the region since the state establishment in 1932. And to an extent, it went several phases. And the most important threat that came was Pan-Arabism, and it had to redefine its existence in pan-Islamic terms in order to make the difference against the Pan-Arab project in the region. And the same thing happened in 1979, that somehow this pan-Islamic that was established throughout the 50s and the 60s became under a threat. So if we're all pan-Islamic, what makes the Saudi kingdom a distinct model? What it makes its model different from other models in the region? And at the very same time, when the Saudi kingdom was facing these sort of questions, the relative power distribution in the region was not particularly clear. On the one hand, there is Iraq that's building its military ambitions, but also at the same time, we have Israel, that its military power is growing by the day. Egypt was not very clear. It was retreating from the Arab sphere after the Arab-Israeli peace treaty. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia was facing one of those moments where the region is changing, but also the material structure is changing, the alliances are changing, and it's also a time where choices have to be made. So to summarize that, the physical security of the kingdom was not really threatened, but rather it was its ontological security that was put at risk. And therefore, there was this process of actually perceiving the threat based on this ontological security, and they had to reframe, but also adapt to the situation. One of them was really finding a line of distinction against the Iranian Revolution. And therefore, the easiest distinction was the sectarian one. And that was the beginning of a rise of a sectarian wave in the region, mainly driven by Saudi Arabia trying to find its distinct narrative, but it's also its distinct identity in the region. And that's also something that the ontological security allows us to see, that in many cases in the region, sectarianism is not the threat, it's actually a security. And that's where many actors found their security and stability in promoting a sectarian narrative. And therefore, supporting Saddam Hussein was more or less a mechanism to restore this ontological security. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, the material structure did not really impose a particular option, but at the same time, the identity was not really flexible enough. Having religion and not a particularly strong nationalist identity put further strain on the kingdom in order to frame its identity in a particular way. And the choices to restore its ontological security were not particularly many at the time. Rather, sectarianism was the only option in order to come out from the trouble in 1979. On the other hand, Syria sort of presented a completely different case. The Syrian regime was actually facing critical stress on its physical security. It was isolated at the regional level. It was fearing its Iraq rising and military ambitions, and it's just located on the borders. And to an extent, it was a different situation in 1979, where they felt that they were abandoned by their Egyptian allies, and they had no other ally in the region to support them against their main threat at the time, which was Israel. And therefore, Syria was actually facing a situation that it had no other option from a physical security perspective other than finding an ally that would support it against its war against Israel. And therefore, the Iranian Revolution came as the savior, that Iran is willing to support and stand against Israel. It's willing to ally with Syria, but at the same time, there was the problem of the identity. Syria was a pan-Arab, Ba'athist, secular regime. And to an extent, this identity more or less contradicts a decision to ally with Iran. How to solve this sort of dissonance and this sort of contradiction. But the most important thing, that Syria was facing physical insecurity, but at the same time, the identity was or could be going through a problem or a contradiction should it make that decision to ally against Iran. So the first priority was really restoring the physical security. And somehow the only option, the structure did not really provide many options. The only option was rather just allying with Iran against Iraq and Israel. At the same time, Syria was not really in the same situation in Saudi Arabia as, for example, having a rigid identity or a fixed identity. Instead, there were many layers in Syria's identity that enabled the regime to shape and reframe its identity narrative, rather provide a different meaning, a different interpretation of what is being an Arab in the region. And based on that, it could actually make the decision to ally with Iran to preserve its physical security, but at the same time, reframe and readapt its identity in order to accommodate that decision and to accommodate its physical security needs. So in a way, you can see from these two cases, these are really extreme cases in that situation where the ideational and the material actually shape the decisions. And we have one case, which is Saudi Arabia, which had extreme ontological insecurity, and the case of Syria, which has extreme physical insecurity. And these two extreme cases show that basically the two spheres of security, the ideational and the material, are in constant shaping and reshaping as the alliance decision is being made. So this is just one example, and the rest of the book talks about other examples as well, in the same way, trying to show how these ideational and material go through several reframing and reshaping over time. So in a way, this approach and this theoretical argument has several contributions. It's moving beyond the either or dichotomy. It's not either identity or material, it's rather both. And every decision and every case shows how these two intermingle, and they are not necessarily co-constituting, but they're shaping each other in many ways. But also looking at the contribution to understand threats in a different way, understand alliances in the Middle East in a different way. They're not just one single decision that's taken and that's it. It's actually a process. And this whole process takes several phases and several interactions among several variables. And after all, looking at the alliance decisions in this, let's say, eclectic way gives us a different understanding of many themes and in many topics in the region, like sectarianism, for example. Sectarianism is not always a threat. It could be actually ontological security for many actors. And there is a need for them to employ these sectarian narratives in order to survive. But after all, as well, the Middle East provides several tools for developing our theoretical understanding beyond the region. We have very strong cases with extreme identity insecurity, with extreme physical insecurity. And to an extent, the book is just providing illustration and examples of cases that could shape our understanding of alliance politics, not just in the Middle East, but also beyond. And finally, the book actually has several limitations. There are many issues that could not be addressed, and hopefully this could be picked up in future research. The first important development, especially after 2011, is really the question of non-state actors. And they're not just proxies. Many of the research and many of the cases that we've seen in the last couple of years, they show that non-state actors are independent actors. they have a high level of autonomy, and they could be actually actors taking alliance decisions. Nevertheless, we don't really have mechanisms, and we don't have enough understanding of whether they make decisions about alliances the same way as states or not. And this remains to be researched and studied. Also, the book has an important limitation because it really focuses on the regional level, and it has the international and the global level in the background. The Middle East has been constantly a penetrated region by great powers, and often great powers shape alliance decisions in many ways. Nevertheless, we don't have a clear understanding of how this happens. Especially after 2011, it became very clear that the perceived decline of the US role in the region has driven many alliances after 2011, has drove several actors in the region to behave in a different way, to change their security perception. And yet, we don't really have an understanding of how the global affects decisions at the regional level. And finally, small states' behavior. Whether, for example, these alliance decisions are the same when they're taken by regional actors or regional powers or middle powers. Can the same theories be applied when it comes to small states? And again, these questions became even more pressing after 2011, as we have many small states. Now we cannot really call them small states, but they are behaving the way regional powers are behaving. And therefore, these are all questions that prompt us to find answers, to develop more our understanding of threat and threat perception. I'm just gonna stop here. Thank you for your attention. And just one final observation, there are 30% discount on the book. It's a super expensive book. Please don't buy it. Just ask your library to buy it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, May. That was a very engaging, clear, and rich presentation. And it's an example of a presentation that I think will make people to want to read the book even more, rather than feeling like they've grasped everything, because I think you just touched on the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So thanks so much, and it's good to hear that there is a discount on it. We have actually quite a few questions. I have questions as well, like, because you stimulated lots of ideas, and that if I don't have a chance to do that, we can have our own chat another time. But yeah, I will go straight to the questions that we have. Thank you, everyone. And I'll start off with Fatima Khalut's question. And so what I'll do is I'll take her around, and then you can gather them. And if we have time, we'll have another round. And Fatima asks, she says, hello. And she says, I'd like to know, what is your perception after the Lebanese war in 2006? So I guess what your perception of the situation is. How Hezbollah and the Hezbollah-Israeli war reshaped Hezbollah's image in the Middle East region, and if this conflict has legitimated its influence in the region through new alliances. So I think that speaks really well to that, the connection between, or the interaction between the material and the ideational that you were speaking to. And then we have another question from Mahdi Barajawi, who says, thank you for the amazing presentation. And he says, I've read your brilliant book where you start by suggesting that you are not proposing a grand theory for threat perception and subsequent foreign policy. And it's the same case in most of the emerging books. Why do you think that most scholars are not taking a step forward in proposing a grand theory for the study of the Middle East? Are you in, and he provokes you, he provides a provocative question in a good way, are you in a way or another confirming the exceptionalism of the Middle East? So I'll start off with those two, and then we'll go on to the rest afterwards.
Thank you, Jasmine, very much. So Fatima, thank you very much for your question. Yes, the Lebanon war, even though it was not like a regional war, the way one can describe a regional war or compare to, for example, the Iran-Iraq war, because it was just limited to Lebanon and only Israel and Hezbollah they were directly involved in the conflict. Nevertheless, its ramification has been extremely important. Like the same thing for the Gaza war of 2009, because it really drew the attention of the whole region as to the questions of the resistance, but also the question as to what is a threat. And in 2006, it was the most important divide that came afterwards in a great article by Morten Valbjørn and André Bang. They were talking that the divides that this war, let's say, unraveled are the divides between the people and the regimes. And to an extent, somehow, even though the regimes perceived Hezbollah as a threat, and that was the case of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, you would walk around the Arab world and you would see the photos of Hassan Nasrallah everywhere at the time during the war, in Cairo, in Amman. There were even protests going out in support of Hezbollah's war. And to an extent, this was particularly challenging for many of these regimes to justify their threat perception and justify why they were taking these decisions of considering Hezbollah to be a threat. And a few weeks later, after the war started, the regime started backtracking a little bit and taking a step back and not really making these bold statements about how Hezbollah is the one to blame for the war. Nevertheless, this did not really continue. We had a very similar pattern in 2009, but unfortunately, after 2011, the divides in the region started really taking a different pattern. And also Hezbollah's involvement afterwards in the Syria crisis after 2011 also changed the perception, the public perception of Hezbollah in the region. So to an extent, the war really showed how this idea of the threat perception may be contested by the people against the regimes, and how the regime perception might not be as objective as one can think, but it also really showed the limits of identity reshaping and identity reframing. So in many of these cases where the regimes could actually control the narrative, they were unable to control the narrative against Hezbollah. I hope I answered your questions. And Mehdi's question, I think, to be honest, it's just, let's say it's a technical, not really a technical issue, but I think we have different understanding of what theories are. So there's a grand theory, there's a theoretical framework, there's a theoretical model. And in a way, a grand theory is a theory that has a statement about how the world is working, how it works in a specific way. If we have conditions A and B, we must have an outcome. And in that sense, the theoretical framework that I'm presenting does not really make these big claims about alliances. It rather looks at a very specific type of dynamic within the alliance decision. So it's not really offering a comprehensive understanding of all alliances everywhere. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't explain things beyond the Middle East. On the contrary, there are many cases around the world. If you look at them, you will find how the ideational and the material intermingle. Look at the UK and the case of Brexit, for example, how the identity is being shaped sometimes by interest, and how sometimes the narrative are being changed to accommodate the interest in its interaction with several European countries. But also look at the history of Europe, the wars, everything has been always constantly an interaction between ideational and material. So in that sense, the Middle East is not really exceptional in any way. It's only the things are more amplified in the Middle East because we have so many types of identities. So we only could see things clearer than others, but it's not really exceptional in any way.
Great, thank you for your answers, May. I think people, their brains have started to work and they are providing lots of questions, so I'll try to get through this, but in the time that we have. Right, where should I go first? Let me start with Louisa Charioli, and she says, first, thank you for yet another amazing presentation. While reading your work, I'm faced with a question of how discussing an identity for states or regimes, whether this is this idea anthropomorphizes the state or the regime, sorry, in the sense how to tackle this may be contradictory, or sorry, contradicting the idea. that if states or regimes are made by individuals, how can they have an identity for themselves, more or less independent of the executives in power? And while I agree with the foundations of the idea of regime identity, I've suffered frequently with this critique and would be interested to listen to your view on it. Sympathies with you, Louisa. The other question from Syed Tahsin Raza. It's nice to learn about your book, and your theorization may be of help for us to understand the South Asian conundrum. It's a good point. If I may ask you, how will you account for the Palestinian issue and the current differing stand of Iran and Saudi Arabia and Egypt in particular? And let me put in one final question in this round. This is from Amar Munassar, who says, do threat perceptions affect or shape national role conceptions of regional powers in the region, particularly after the Arab Spring? So just these three for now.
Right, thank you all for your questions. I'm gonna start with Louisa. Well, definitely it's a big questions about regimes and state in the Middle East. And I mean, in the book, in the theory chapter, I have a long discussions about what is a regime, what's the identity of the regime. But very briefly, the regime, it's not individuals, it's rather a coalition of individuals that form a network. And this network is often going through the institutions, the different institutions of the state. So in a way, we're not talking about a leader, we're rather talking about a leader.
May, we're losing the sound a bit. I don't know if it might be a connection issue. Try again. Oh, we can hear you now. Yeah, it's better.
Okay, sorry. So I'm just gonna go back. Yeah, so the regimes are just the network, a network of individuals who also have a network in different institutions in the state. And to an extent, it's a coalition of several individuals, of sometimes institutions, and to an extent, it's really about forming some level of understanding about what the state should be about. And to an extent, the regime is forming this it's the understanding of the regime, what is this country's about, what is the role of this country, what's the identity of this country. And unfortunately, in the Middle East, the question of the state development is not particularly addressed in the regime perspective, but it's rather intermingling, because at one point the regime is capturing the state. So the state only becomes one component of the whole regime. You have, for example, the case of Saudi Arabia, where the name of the state itself is named after the family, which is the ruling regime. It's impossible to understand Egypt without understanding the military institution, which is taking control of the state, of different institutions, of the bureaucracy. So in a way, we have regimes that captured the state. And I think that was also very well explained in an article by Lisa Anderson, long way back. And it is a case of the regime becoming an independent unit, and they have their own idea about the identity of the state. And that's usually the regime identity that I talk about. Moving on to I think, Sayed, the question about theorization, South Asian conundrum, I would totally agree. And I think this is definitely would be a really, really interesting case. And I would love to see the theoretical framework, if it's going to hold in that context or not. But in general, South Asia has constituted a very good comparison for the Middle East, especially, for example, on the nuclear issues, the nuclearization, but also on many other cases when it comes to alliances and shifting alliances. So definitely, and I think the only way of knowing that is actually by doing the research and doing these sort of cross-regional comparison. And on your question on the Palestinian issue, I think by the Palestinian issue, you mean Hamas, if I'm being correct, I'm not sure. But I think on the Hamas question, definitely Hamas has been one of the most puzzling cases when it comes to alliance choices. They're shifting alliances, but also the way they use alliances in order to survive. And definitely, I think it's really under research, and it's often overlooked as somehow it's a non-state actors in the end but it's a unit, or the decision-making unit is particularly unique because you have some of the leaders are in the Gaza Strip, and the most influential decision makers are situated outside of Palestine. Some of them were in Damascus before the crisis started, some of them are in Kuwait, and some of them are in Egypt. And to an extent, decisions that usually is made by Hamas and its foreign policy are often reflecting the power distribution between these group of decision makers. So I think this is a fascinating case that I would definitely, if I have the time one day, to examine how the alliance choices are changing. Sorry, I totally missed the third question by Omar. Do threat perceptions affect or shape national role conceptions of regional powers? Definitely, and the other way around. And again, some threat perceptions make some cases or make some countries to change the way they are shaping their roles. To give you just an example is the Saudi behavior, especially after 2011, when they realized that the US is not really willing to intervene directly in the Syria crisis. And all of a sudden they realized, okay, our threat perception is completely different than the US priorities in the region, and we have to take control of that. And based on that, there was a huge change in Saudi foreign policy and its understanding of role in the region by trying to play a more assertive role. So you have a perfect example here of a threat perception actually pushing countries to change their role conceptions. Jasmine, you're on mute too.
Yeah, thank you. Very rich answers. I'm aware that we have a panel straight after this, and you have a meeting to go to as well. So I'm going to round up the remaining questions and summarize them a bit. I think one of them, well, they all say they love your book or that they're planning to read it and they thought the presentation was great. So I'm going to summarize that in that way. Very effusive in the praise. Francesco asked a question about another case study that you might use, and I think you answered it when you were talking about the South Asian case. It did also say, are there any other regional cases? Let me go to a question by Curtis, who says, right, he's fascinated by the Syrian-Iraqi rift, and do you see it also as ontological insecurity in addition to a material threat because of the Ba'ath versus the Ba'ath aspect, not just as an ideological rift, but also as a perceived threat to the regional centrality of Damascus, as Assad then seemed to view Syria as the appropriate regional leader and may have seen Iraq as a dangerous upstart challenger to Syria's status and security. And as someone who also works on the ideology side of things, that's a question that I also was thinking of, like how much actually does ideology trump some of the security and the material considerations. Gosh, there's lots coming in now. One from Omar Karim, who says, if he understood correctly, the pan-Islamist discourse of the Iranian Revolution threatened Saudi Arabia's standing, but hasn't Saudi's standing and legitimacy and soft power come from them being the custodian of the two holy mosques? And that's something that can't really be challenged or taken away. And then he asks about, why should we give importance to physical insecurity in Saudi's case, especially in relation to protests during the Hajj? Sorry, I summarized it a bit. And then I don't think we have time, but Simon's asked also about the US and the extent to which Saudi Arabia's alliance with the US against Iraq post-1990 and Iran post-2003, like how much of that has an impact. I guess the role of external, like non-regional actors. And Chris has given an essay. Maybe you can write a joint paper on this. He's basically asking the extent to which, how flexible and fluid do you think identity is in foreign policy making? And he gives the example of Mohammed bin Salman trying hard to reframe Saudi identity away from this sort of Sunni Islamic identity of the past, what Omar was talking about, to a more of a nation state nationalism. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Right. Thank you all very much for these great questions, and apologies if I'm not going to be able to answer us fully to all of them. But I think the first question, Oh, I forgot. No, I think I'm just gonna answer the Curtis question. Thank you so much about the Syrian-Iraqi rift, and that's definitely a very, very important episode in the region. There is one book that's published about it, and I'm sure you're aware of it, but at the same time, um, I would also see it as a case of ontological insecurity, and it's also the case about which narrative is the most important and is the most successful. They're both claiming to be Ba'athist, but which interpretation of Ba'athism that should win that sort of conflict? And again, it's a perfect case of similarity creating anxiety and threats rather than bringing these allies together. And what is really puzzling about the Middle East, that the similarity is often the cause of conflict rather than the difference in identity. And that's definitely, again, related to the questions of state building, where there is not yet strong national identity, there is not still strong distinctiveness in the identity, and therefore it's easily feeling that they're still not establishing that sort of consistency and stability in the identity, and it's easily shaken by something that might be arising that's very similar. And linking that to the question by Omar, and that's exactly the case of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the Holy Mosque, and geographically that's not going to change. Nevertheless, the Islamic Revolution was really questioning whether the Al Saud are the best people to manage this. And that's the question of not really changing the geography of the region, but it's rather changing the ruling elites. And that's why their narrative of being the custodian of the Holy Mosque, and that term in itself, custodian of the Holy Mosque, was established during King Fahd in I think if I remember correctly, in the 80s, 1986, if I remember. And it was really during the Iran-Iraq war that they came up with this sort of title in order to emphasize that they are, the legitimate people to look after the holy mosques. So in a way, this similarity is not really about changing things physically, but it's rather about the narrative that comes and the power of the narratives that's behind that. And at the same time, talking about the Eastern Province or the protests during Hajj, they're not really military threats in that sense, but they're rather events that would destabilize the legitimacy of Al Saud for ruling. And that's why, again, even though they are physical in nature, but they're not really another army of another state attacking the Saudi kingdom in that sense. And I think Simon's question on the US against Iraq, again, I think this is definitely one of the most important questions that I think that the book did not really address. And I feel in a way that it was really something that it's a real limitation in the analysis. And at the same time, we don't really have a clear understanding of how this international really, whether it pushes regional allies to actually make decision. Is it a determining factors? I don't think it's a determining one, but it's definitely crucial in changing the perception and the calculations of regional actors. And in a way, I think it's also ideational and it's also material, because on the one hand, there is the support of the great powers materially, but ideationally, there is also the fact that it is about the symbolism and the perception. Sometimes it's just knowing that the US is on one side, and that's, again, the soft side of power that is often being really taken into account in these decisions. And
okay, I might have to, I'm so sorry as chair, I've been told by the technical people that we need to end. I'm sorry. I will just thank you so much for such thorough answers, and thank you to everyone who asked great questions. It was a fantastic presentation. There's so much more for us all to discuss and think on, so definitely we should all read your book. And Maria Marsh from CUP, who is in the session, says that the book is actually going to be out in paperback in October this year, so at a much more affordable price, she says. So that's
yeah.
and also Elias has said that he's going to get everyone out of this session as soon as we close. So those who are planning to attend the next panel, which starts straight afterwards with Simon on Iran in the Middle East, then you'll just rejoin back in afterwards. But just want to finish saying a huge thank you to May.
Thank you, Jasmine, very much. And thank you all for the great questions and the really, really nice event. I only wish it was in person so I could engage with you all personally.
Inshallah in the future, when this pandemic's over. All right. See everyone else at the session, and thank you, May. Bye.
Bye.